On May 31, 1986, during a stage of the Rallye of Hessen in Germany, Marc Surer and his co-driver Michel Wyder were involved in an extremely severe crash that tragically claimed Michel's life. This accident was one of the most violent and devastating incidents of the Group B era, and one that would ultimately contribute to the end of this notoriously dangerous category. But to truly understand how this accident unfolded, we conducted an in-depth technical analysis to examine the factors involved and determine the causes that led to Michel Wyder's death. To fully grasp how the crash occurred, it is essential to understand the car Shurer and Wyder were driving, the Ford RS200. The RS200 was not a production car, nor an evolution of a road-going model. It was a purpose-built rally prototype designed specifically for Group B, a category known for its remarkably permissive technical regulations. The RS200 was powered by a mid-mounted 1.8-liter, 16-valve turbocharged engine capable of producing up to 450 horsepower, while weighing under 2,200 pounds. It featured an all-wheel drive system with mechanically adjustable torque distribution and no electronic driver aids. The chassis combined a relatively rigid central safety cell with bolted front and rear subframes along with an ultralight composite body. The car was exceptionally fast, but also extremely demanding to drive. The turbo did not deliver torque progressively, instead power arrived abruptly. In terms of structural safety, the chassis was not engineered to absorb high-energy lateral impacts against rigid obstacles. In the moments leading up to the crash, Marc was traveling at approximately 125 miles per hour and was in a sustained high-speed cornering phase. The suspension was heavily loaded laterally, and the tires were operating very close to their limit of adhesion. The RS200 was running in a delicate balance, with both lateral and longitudinal forces acting simultaneously. In situations like this, even a small variation in the friction coefficient, caused by a surface irregularity or a nonlinear turbo response, can upset that balance. The loss of control began with a sudden oversteer event. The rear axle lost grip abruptly, and the car began rotating around its vertical axis. When the car left the asphalt and entered the grass and dirt runoff area, the situation deteriorated immediately. The friction coefficient dropped dramatically to minimal values. At that point, the car no longer had the capacity to generate sufficient lateral forces to stabilize itself. It entered an uncontrolled lateral slide, with a significant yaw angle and virtually no reduction in speed. This is one of the key elements in understanding the accident, as there was no progressive deceleration phase before impact. The car did not shed energy gradually. Most of its kinetic energy remained almost entirely intact until the moment of collision. The first impact occurred against a tree located off the roadway, relatively narrow in diameter. However, as a rigid obstacle firmly anchored to the ground, it absorbed very little energy. The collision was lateral and at an oblique angle, a crash geometry particularly unfavorable for any automotive structure. At the instant of impact, the tree applied an extremely concentrated lateral force at a specific point on the car. That force generated a very high shear load and a torsional moment that twisted the structure around its longitudinal axis. The architecture of the RS200 was not designed to withstand this type of load. Because the impact point was offset from the vehicle's longitudinal axis, the combination of composite materials, tubular chassis framework, and bolted joints reached their maximum fatigue limit in mere milliseconds. There was no progressive or controlled deformation. Instead, a structural fracture occurred. Joints between modules failed, chassis elements broke, and body panels disintegrated. This rupture had immediate and critical consequences. The safety cage was no longer an intact protective cell, and cockpit integrity was severely compromised. The engine and transmission became structurally decoupled, fuel and oil lines were torn apart, and the vehicle's trajectory became completely chaotic, eliminating any remaining capacity for further energy absorption by the structure. After this initial impact, the car continued moving until it struck a second, larger tree. This second collision further increased the deformation and destruction of the vehicle, promoting fuel release and the emergence of ignition sources. The fire that followed was a direct consequence of the prior structural failure, as spilled fuel came into contact with hot surfaces. Michel Wyder sustained the majority of the deceleration forces. Although he was not seated on the side that experienced the most direct lateral intrusion, most of the transmitted forces were concentrated toward his side, causing a more severe collapse of the cockpit in his area. The survival space was drastically reduced in a fraction of a second, and the lateral deceleration in that section of the cabin was extremely high and highly localized. Secured by his harness, Michel's body was subjected to brutal lateral compression. His thorax endured loads the human body cannot tolerate. The ribs and sternum collapsed, and his lungs suffered massive contusions. At the same time, his neck and head were exposed to extreme flexion due to the lateral acceleration and the weight of the helmet. In these types of impacts, cervical and cranial injuries are very common. Moreover, Michel remained trapped inside a cockpit that had lost its structural integrity. There was no space for the body to move, nor for the energy to dissipate in a less concentrated manner. The resulting injuries were incompatible with life even before the fire played a decisive role. Marc Surer's situation at the moment of the crash was different. Although he was on the side of the primary impact, the way forces were absorbed differed significantly from those transmitted to Michel Wyder. When the car fractured during the first impact, the structure on Marc's side did not collapse inward in the same manner. Instead of compressing, the cockpit on his side opened up, completely altering the way energy was transferred to his body. At the moment of structural failure, the car decelerated violently, but Marc's body did not do so at the same rate. A large relative velocity difference developed between his body and the vehicle structure. At the same time, the seat and harness anchors were ripped away, and the restraint system stopped working effectively. The result was a partial lateral ejection, not a clean expulsion, but a partial movement of his body out of the cockpit's core. Since his body was not confined within a space that collapsed laterally, Shurer didn't experience a single extreme acceleration spike focused on his chest and neck. Some of the energy was absorbed by the body's movement, secondary impacts, and a deceleration that was somewhat more spread out over time and space. Marc Surer sustained severe and numerous injuries including multiple limb fractures, internal trauma, significant burns from direct exposure to fire, and a prolonged loss of consciousness that led to a coma. However, he did not exhibit signs of massive thoracic crush injury or instantly fatal cervical trauma. The fact that he was not confined within the collapsed cockpit at the most critical moment of impact and was partially ejected likely saved his life. Tragically, after the second impact and the onset of the fire, Michel Wyder died while trapped inside the vehicle. Shurer, having been partially outside the structural core, was not immobilized in the area of greatest fire intensity and was able to be extracted by several spectators, although with extremely serious injuries. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoy this kind of content, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed and gave this video a like, because your support allows me to keep creating these kinds of analyses and reconstructions, and you'll also stay up to date with all the new content we post on the channel. Before signing off, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and find out what you think caused this brutal crash. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be reading your comments, and I'll see you in the next video.